Ethan never believed that love could arrive loudly. He was convinced it slipped in quietly, disguised as routine, hiding inside ordinary days that seemed no different from the rest. His life moved with steady predictability, framed by early mornings, long commutes, and evenings that ended before they truly began. He felt safe in this structure, even if it left him strangely hollow, as though something essential had been postponed without his consent. Everything began to shift during a season that carried no clear beginning. The city changed its rhythm, becoming heavier, slower, saturated with unspoken tension. Ethan noticed how people avoided eye contact, how conversations felt unfinished, how even familiar streets seemed to stretch farther than before. In this altered atmosphere, he became more aware of himself, of his habits, his silences, and the way he often chose distance over risk. She entered his awareness not as a sudden presence, but as a gradual certainty. There was no defining moment, no single memory he could point to as the start. Instead, she existed as a growing weight in his thoughts, subtle yet persistent. Without realizing it, Ethan began adjusting his days around this feeling, sensing that whatever was unfolding would not ask for permission, nor offer an easy way back. Ethan began noticing how the smallest changes unsettled him more than major disruptions ever had. A delayed train, an unfinished thought, a lingering glance he could not explain. Each detail carried a weight that followed him throughout the day. His attention drifted inward, forcing him to confront emotions he had long considered irrelevant. The calm he once valued started to feel fragile, as if one careless movement could fracture it completely. The presence that had quietly entered his life grew more defined, shaping the space around him without demanding acknowledgement. He found himself reflecting on moments that had not yet happened, imagining outcomes he had never allowed himself to consider. This unfamiliar anticipation unsettled him, blurring the line between restraint and longing. What disturbed him most was not the desire itself, but how willingly he began to surrender to it. As days passed, Ethan sensed a subtle transformation taking place within him. His routines no longer felt like protection, but like barriers he had constructed to avoid uncertainty. The idea of dismantling them filled him with both relief and dread. Somewhere between hesitation and hope, he understood that whatever this connection became, it would reshape him in ways he could no longer control. The city seemed to mirror Ethan's internal unrest, shifting unpredictably between clarity and confusion. Streets he had walked for years now felt unfamiliar, as though they were quietly observing his hesitation. He became more sensitive to time, measuring his days not by clocks, but by fleeting emotions that surfaced without warning. Each passing hour carried an unspoken question he refused to articulate. This growing awareness did not bring comfort. Instead, it exposed how carefully he had arranged his life to avoid uncertainty. He recognized patterns in his behavior, how he delayed decisions, softened desires, and convinced himself that restraint was maturity. Yet beneath this self-control lingered a persistent ache, suggesting that caution had slowly transformed into avoidance. Without realizing it, Ethan began leaning toward vulnerability. His thoughts wandered beyond logic, guided by intuition rather than reason. The connection unfolding within him felt irreversible, not because it demanded action, but because it altered his perception of everything else. He sensed that resisting this change would cost him more than embracing it, even if the outcome remained unknown. Ethan started to sense how silence could carry its own kind of pressure. Moments without sound no longer felt empty. They felt crowded with meaning he struggled to interpret. His mind replayed fragments of thoughts, rearranging them into possibilities that felt both distant and dangerously close. Rest no longer came easily, as his awareness refused to settle into familiar calm. The emotional shift unsettled his sense of control. He noticed how easily his focus drifted, how frequently he questioned decisions that once seemed permanent. Stability, which had defined his identity for years, began to resemble stagnation. The realization did not arrive as panic, but as quiet disappointment in how little he had allowed himself to want. Gradually, Ethan accepted that this transformation was not something to solve, but something to experience. The connection growing inside him demanded presence rather than certainty. For the first time in years, he considered the possibility that discomfort might not be a warning, but an invitation toward something honest, fragile, and undeniably real. The days that followed carried an unfamiliar intensity, as if each moment waited for his reaction. Ethan felt exposed to his surroundings in ways he could not explain, absorbing emotions from passing expressions, unfinished gestures, and subtle shifts in tone. Ordinary interactions seemed layered, hiding meanings beneath their surface that he had never bothered to notice before. He began reflecting on past connections, not with regret, but with a strange clarity. Patterns emerged: how he had mistaken distance for independence, how he had equated silence with strength. These realizations did not accuse him, they simply existed, steady and undeniable. Love, he understood now, was not absent from his life by accident, but by design. This awareness softened something within him. The connection he felt was no longer abstract, it had begun reshaping his values. He sensed that opening himself emotionally would require surrender rather than effort. Though uncertainty remained, it no longer felt threatening. Instead, it carried the promise of movement, urging him beyond the stillness he had once mistaken for peace. As Ethan moved through his days, he became increasingly aware of how deeply this internal shift was affecting his perception of time. Hours no longer passed unnoticed. They lingered, stretching into reflective spaces where thoughts gathered without restraint. He caught himself pausing more often, as if the world required his full attention instead of his habitual detachment. Even solitude, once comforting, now carried a quiet tension that asked something from him. This heightened awareness forced him to confront emotions he had long postponed. He recognized a longing not just for connection, but for authenticity, for a version of himself unfiltered by caution or expectation. The presence shaping his inner world challenged his tendency to remain distant, revealing how much he had sacrificed in the name of control. He realized that avoiding pain had also meant avoiding depth, leaving his experiences incomplete. Gradually, Ethan accepted that change rarely arrives with clarity. It unfolds through uncertainty, through moments that feel unbalanced and unresolved. The connection growing within him did not offer reassurance, only honesty. Yet that honesty felt grounding, anchoring him to something real. For the first time, he understood that love was not a disruption to his life, but a force capable of giving it dimension and meaning. The emotional weight Ethan carried no longer felt temporary. It settled into his daily movements, shaping the way he observed people and places. He noticed how easily others expressed fragments of themselves, offering vulnerability without hesitation. This openness intrigued him, highlighting the restraint he had practiced for so long. He began questioning whether protection had ever truly served him, or if it had simply delayed his own growth. His internal resistance weakened as curiosity replaced fear. Instead of analyzing every feeling, he allowed them to exist without definition. This shift did not bring immediate clarity, but it introduced a sense of freedom he had not experienced before. The absence of certainty no longer felt like failure. It felt like space, room for something genuine to emerge without pressure or expectation. In this space, Ethan sensed the quiet presence of possibility. The connection forming within him no longer demanded explanation. It simply asked for attention, patience, and courage. Though the path ahead remained undefined, he understood that remaining unchanged would cost him more than the risk of moving forward. The realization did not promise happiness, but it offered truth, and that felt enough to continue. Ethan's perception of himself began to shift in subtle but persistent ways. He became aware of how often he had shaped his identity around what was expected rather than what was felt. This realization unsettled him, exposing the quiet compromises he had accepted as necessary. The connection growing within him illuminated these truths without judgment, allowing reflection instead of regret. He noticed an unfamiliar tenderness in his reactions. Moments that once passed unnoticed now stirred something deeper, awakening emotions he had carefully ignored. This sensitivity did not weaken him as he once believed it would. Instead, it expanded his understanding of strength. He recognized that emotional presence required more courage than detachment ever had. As this awareness settled, Ethan felt a growing sense of alignment between thought and feeling. The distance he had maintained from his own desires slowly diminished. While uncertainty still surrounded him, it no longer felt paralyzing. He sensed that whatever awaited him beyond this transformation would demand honesty above all else, and for the first time, he felt prepared to offer it. The rhythm of Ethan's life no longer felt accidental. Each day seemed to carry intention, even when nothing outwardly changed. He became more aware of how his emotions influenced his choices, guiding him toward moments he once avoided. The connection shaping his inner world sharpened his awareness, making him attentive to subtle shifts in mood, memory, and desire. He no longer rushed through experiences, allowing them to unfold without resistance. This attentiveness revealed how deeply he had underestimated his own emotional capacity. Feelings he once labeled as distractions now appeared essential, offering insight rather than disruption. He recognized that intimacy was not built through grand gestures, but through sustained presence and willingness to be seen. The idea unsettled him, yet it also felt undeniably true, reshaping his understanding of closeness. With this realization came a quiet confidence. Ethan no longer felt compelled to define what he was becoming. The connection did not promise permanence, but it encouraged sincerity. He understood that love was less about certainty and more about participation, about choosing to remain open even when outcomes remained unclear. This acceptance grounded him, allowing forward movement without fear of losing himself. Ethan began to sense how deeply his inner transformation had altered his relationship with uncertainty. What once felt like a threat now appeared as an open horizon, undefined yet full of potential. He noticed how easily he adapted to moments that previously unsettled him, meeting them with curiosity rather than control. This shift did not erase fear, but it softened its influence, allowing space for trust to develop. The connection within him matured into something steady, no longer fragile or hesitant. It did not demand constant attention, yet it remained present, quietly shaping his perspective. He found himself valuing honesty over reassurance, recognizing that clarity often emerged through discomfort. This understanding grounded him, replacing his need for certainty with a willingness to remain engaged. As this chapter of self-discovery deepened, Ethan understood that love was not an endpoint but a process. It unfolded through patience, awareness, and resilience. The connection he felt did not define him, but it expanded him, revealing dimensions of his identity he had never explored. With this realization, he felt prepared to continue forward, not knowing where the path would lead, but trusting its direction. Ethan began to recognize the subtle ways his emotions influenced perception. Ordinary encounters and fleeting observations now carried layers he had never noticed before. A passing smile, a hesitant gesture, or the tone of a voice could spark reflection that lasted for hours. Each detail became a thread weaving through his consciousness, drawing him closer to a profound awareness of connection and vulnerability. He discovered that surrendering to these sensations did not weaken him. It expanded the contours of his experience. He noticed the interplay between longing and restraint, the tension between desire and hesitation, and the quiet power of choice. With every realization, he felt more present, more attuned to the nuances of both his own feelings and the unspoken cues of others. By the evening, a sense of equilibrium settled around him. The connection that had begun as a subtle undercurrent had grown into a steady current, shaping his thoughts without forcing direction. He understood that love, in its truest form, demanded patience and courage, a willingness to navigate uncertainty while honoring authenticity. The recognition did not simplify his life, but it made it richer, opening the possibility for experiences he had once avoided. Ethan noticed how ordinary moments now carried extraordinary weight. The act of walking through familiar streets, observing shadows cast by streetlights, or hearing distant conversations became opportunities for reflection. Each encounter, no matter how brief, seemed to resonate with significance, reinforcing the subtle connection growing within him. He understood that perception itself could transform experience, and that attentiveness could uncover hidden depths in the mundane. This growing awareness reshaped the way he approached relationships. Past hesitations no longer felt permanent. Instead, they appeared as patterns he could recognize and navigate. He realized that vulnerability was not a weakness, but a tool for deeper engagement, allowing him to approach interactions with honesty rather than guardedness. The connection he felt no longer hovered on the edge of abstraction. It had become a tangible influence, guiding his choices and thoughts. By nightfall, Ethan found himself contemplating the larger implications of this internal shift. He acknowledged that love was not merely a sentiment to be felt, but an ongoing process requiring courage and presence. The quiet tension between desire and restraint, once troubling, now felt like an essential rhythm of life. With this understanding, he embraced the uncertainty, aware that growth often required discomfort, and that true connection could only exist when he allowed himself to fully participate. Ethan began to notice the way small gestures carried profound meaning. A hand extended in kindness, a glance held a second too long, a tone of voice gentle yet deliberate. All of these details lingered in his mind longer than he expected. They made him reconsider his assumptions about relationships and intimacy, revealing that love was not always about grand declarations, but about consistent, understated presence. Every action, however subtle, became a lesson in attentiveness and patience. The connection within him evolved, no longer a vague notion but a living part of his awareness. It influenced his choices and colored his perception of the world. Simple routines now felt alive with possibility, each moment a potential turning point. He realized that love's power lay not in certainty, but in the willingness to remain open and present, even when outcomes were unclear or unpredictable. Evenings became reflective spaces, moments when Ethan allowed himself to sit with these new realizations. He observed his own thoughts with a quiet curiosity, noting the tension between fear and desire. This awareness was neither burdensome nor effortless. It demanded focus and honesty. Yet, through it all, he felt a deepening sense of alignment, an inner confirmation that embracing vulnerability was the only way to experience a love that could truly transform him. Ethan discovered that the act of noticing could be transformative. Ordinary events, the flutter of leaves in the wind, distant laughter, the faint scent of coffee drifting through a street, no longer passed him by. Each detail became a brushstroke in a larger picture, connecting him to both the world and the growing emotional current within himself. The realization that meaning existed in subtlety altered the way he moved through life, compelling him to remain present rather than retreat. This heightened awareness reshaped his interactions. He approached people with gentleness, observing without judgment and listening without interruption. The connection forming inside him demanded authenticity, encouraging him to embrace emotions he had long avoided. Vulnerability, once intimidating, now appeared as a bridge, an essential passage to deeper understanding, both of himself and of others. Nightfall offered a quiet reflection, a space to reconcile the changes within. Ethan felt neither resolution nor complete clarity, but an undeniable sense of progress. The connection he had nurtured was no longer a tentative undercurrent, but a steady presence guiding him. It reminded him that love was not always loud or immediate. Sometimes, it existed in patient attention, subtle gestures, and the courage to remain open when the outcome remained unknown. Ethan sensed a profound shift as he moved through another ordinary day. The moments he once considered insignificant, passing glances, the rhythm of footsteps on pavement, the distant hum of the city, now carried resonance. Each detail seemed to echo within him, reinforcing the subtle connection that had quietly grown over time. He realized that love was not always immediate or dramatic. Often, it was the accumulation of attentive, sustained presence. The awareness of this connection transformed his perception of himself. He no longer sought to control every emotion or circumstance, understanding that surrendering to uncertainty was not weakness, but a choice of authenticity. Vulnerability became a companion rather than a threat, guiding his actions and lending depth to his experiences. The internal landscape that had once been rigid and protective now felt expansive, capable of holding both longing and patience simultaneously. As evening fell, Ethan reflected on the journey he had undertaken, the quiet evolution of his heart and mind. He recognized that love's power was not measured by certainty or outcome, but by willingness to notice, to feel, and to remain open despite ambiguity. With this understanding, he embraced the present moment fully, aware that true connection required courage, patience, and the quiet devotion to live through each subtle, transformative instant. Ethan realized that change was rarely sudden. It unfolded in layers, imperceptible yet persistent. Even the smallest gestures, the way a shadow stretched across a sidewalk or the warmth of sunlight spilling through a window, seemed to carry meaning he had never noticed. Each moment felt like a subtle instruction, inviting him to pay attention, to observe without rushing, to absorb life with a sensitivity he had long denied himself. The city around him no longer seemed ordinary. Every detail held weight, and every encounter contained possibility. This attentiveness reshaped his understanding of connection. He found himself moved not only by actions, but by intention, tone, and the spaces between words. Vulnerability, once a threat to his carefully constructed identity, now appeared as a bridge toward something genuine. The connection growing inside him was neither hurried nor loud. It required patience, awareness, and quiet courage to nurture, as if it depended on his ability to inhabit the present fully, rather than seek reassurance in certainty. As night settled, Ethan felt a resonance within that had not existed before. The emotional landscape he had cultivated was now a guiding force, shaping how he moved, how he observed, and how he felt. Love, he understood, was not a singular event or declaration. It was a series of attentive choices, a commitment to presence, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. In this realization, he found both freedom and responsibility, the delicate balance that made connection not only possible but profoundly transformative.